The champagne glasses clinked like crystal bells, catching the light from chandeliers worth more than most people's homes. Laughter floated across the grand ballroom, the kind of laughter that isn't really about joy, but about signaling who belongs, and who doesn't. At the far end of the room, Serena Daniels stood in a black silk evening gown. She had been invited as a guest of honor, or so she thought, a quiet force in the world of renewable energy investments. Serena had built a reputation for turning struggling projects into billion-dollar ventures. She wasn't here by accident. She was here because the Lawson family, one of America's wealthiest dynasties, wanted her to partner on an ambitious clean tech infrastructure deal worth over $1 billion. Or at least, that was the official reason. Across the room, a young man in a white dinner jacket, one of the Lawson heirs, caught sight of her. His smirk spread slowly. He whispered something into the ear of his sister, who stifled a laugh. A few others glanced over, and the ripple of amusement began to spread like a cruel secret. Serena noticed. You always notice. The moment sharpened when the family matriarch approached. With a champagne flute in one hand, she looked Serena over from head to toe. "Oh, Serena," she said, her voice dripping with the polished venom only the rich have perfected. "I didn't realize the help was joining us inside tonight." Laughter, sharp and brittle, cut through the music. It was a joke, but not a joke. Serena's breath slowed, a flush rose to her cheeks, but her eyes, still, calm, unreadable. This was not the first time she had been underestimated. She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment that would define the next 6 months of her life, the moment that would decide whether she would play the role they expected, or rewrite the ending altogether. Here's what that moment teaches us. When someone publicly tries to diminish you, they're not just making a personal insult, they're testing your place in the unspoken hierarchy. Your reaction, in that split second, tells them whether you'll stay in the box they've built for you, or quietly prepare to burn it down. Serena smiled, took a slow sip of champagne, and simply said, "Enjoy the party. We still talk soon." She walked away, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. That night she decided she would never allow them to dictate the terms of her worth, not in business, not in life, and by the time she was done, their billion-dollar deal would collapse, because she would dismantle it from the inside. The question is, how do you take down a dynasty without firing a single shot? We'll get there, but first, you need to understand exactly how Serena got here, and why this wasn't just about her pride. It was about the power structures that have been standing for centuries. Long before Serena Daniels walked into that gilded ballroom, she had learned that power rarely looks like it does in the movies. It's not the loud voices, or the headlines, or even the visible wealth. True power, she discovered, is in the invisible, in the unspoken agreements, the backroom favors, the phone calls that changed the course of entire industries, without a single email ever being sent. Serena grew up in Wilmington, North Carolina, in a modest home where every bill was paid with sacrifice. Her mother worked nights as a nurse. Her father drove trucks, gone for weeks at a time. There was no generational wealth to fall back on, no legacy company waiting for her name to be stamped on the door. What she did have was a mind that saw patterns others missed, and an unshakable calm that unnerved people who thrived on intimidation. By the time she was 26, she was already managing multi-million-dollar renewable energy portfolios. She understood the science, the policy, and more importantly, the people. She knew how to read a room, how to sense when someone was selling an idea they didn't believe in, how to dismantle an argument without raising her voice. But with every step upward came the same subtle resistance. You said her impressive, but too young, too direct, too ambitious, too black for some circles, that pretended meritocracy was their guiding star. This deal with the Lawson family wasn't just another project. It was a potential paradigm shift, a billion-dollar renewable infrastructure initiative that could bring clean power to millions, while securing Serena's position as one of the most influential black women in global finance. But the Lawsons were not in the business of sharing power, they were in the business of acquiring it. And here's the truth about dynasties like theirs. Their wealth is older than your grandparents' memories. It has survived wars, recessions, political upheavals, not because they were the smartest in the room, but because the system was built to ensure they never had to lose. For Serena, walking into that ballroom wasn't just walking into a party, it was walking into the beating heart of an economic ecosystem that had been operating, unchallenged, for over a century. The insult that night, the help comment, wasn't just a careless jab, it was the tell. The moment the mask slipped, and the Lawsons revealed exactly where they believed she belonged. She didn't respond in anger, because she understood something critical. In environments where you are outnumbered in power, every visible reaction becomes data they will weaponize against you. Instead, she filed it away. Every smirk, every sideways glance, every exclusion from certain conversations. These were not just slights, they were early warnings. And here sits what that moment in the ballroom really exposed. This was not going to be a straightforward business deal. It was going to be a chess match, and the board was already tilted. The root cause of this tension was older than either party, a collision between the old guard's need to maintain supremacy and Serena's refusal to play the role assigned to her. But the real question wasn't whether she could close the deal. It was whether she could do it without losing herself, or whether she would be forced to choose between walking away quietly or striking in a way they'd never forget. She didn't know it yet, but that choice was coming, and it would arrive sooner than she thought. 2 weeks after the ballroom incident, Serena sat in a mahogany-paneled boardroom, across from the Lawsons and their team of advisors. The table was long enough to seat 20, but somehow it still felt like there wasn't enough air in the room. The presentation was supposed to be a straightforward project update. Instead it became something else entirely. Halfway through, the patriarch William Lawson III leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Miss Daniels," he began, "we've been reviewing the risk projections for this project. Given the scale, we believe it's best if you take on an advisory role rather than an equity stake. You'd still be well compensated, of course. But ownership, that's a big leap." There it was, the cut, dressed in polite language. Advisory meant expendable. Advisory meant no control. Advisory meant no control. Advisory meant she would get a paycheck, but they'd get the legacy. Serena felt every eye on her. Her legal counsel shifted in his seat, waiting to see if she'd protest. The Lawsons, for their part, looked as if they were doing her a favor. She could take the offer, swallow the insult, and still walk away with a comfortable payout. That would be the safe play. It would also mean that the communities she had planned to prioritize in the rollout, predominantly black and low-income neighborhoods, long ignored in clean energy investments, would be sidelined in favor of more profitable demographics. Or, she could push back, knowing full well that it could trigger the kind of retaliation only billionaires can afford. Here sits the thing most people miss about moral crossroads. It's not just about what you choose, it's about when you choose it. The earlier you draw your line in the sand, the more you risk losing, but wait too long, and you may find the line's been erased entirely. Serena asked for a short recess. She stepped outside into the hallway, the sound of her heels echoing against the marble. In that quiet space, she remembered her father's words from years ago, after she had lost a major scholarship due to an administrative error that mysteriously benefited another student. "They sir betting you sell take what you cert, given, because it's sir given because it sits easier than fighting. You have to decide if you sir the kind of woman who proves them right." When she walked back into that boardroom, her decision was made, but she didn't announce it outright, not yet. The Lawsons thought the game was still theirs. They were wrong. Because Serena understood something they didn't. Sometimes the smartest move at a moral fork in the road is to take neither path they've laid out for you. She was about to build her own. The Lawsons thought they knew Serena Daniels. They had her resume, her deal history, even the glossy profiles from business magazines that painted her as the rising star of renewable finance. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that every setback in her career had forced her to build invisible layers of defense. Serena had spent years cultivating a network that didn't show up on LinkedIn. She wasn't just connected to venture capitalists and policy experts. She had relationships with investigative journalists, community leaders, mid-level government regulators, and a few powerful figures who owed her more than a favor. And she had something else the Lawsons would never have, the trust of people on the ground. For months before this deal even hit the headlines, Serena had been quietly partnering with local municipalities, nonprofits, and grassroots organizations. She was mapping out not just the technical feasibility of the clean energy project, but its political insulation, the kind of embedded support that made it nearly impossible to uproot without causing a public relations storm. This wasn't just business to her, this was legacy. Here sits the first small reversal of power. While the Lawsons believed she needed their name to legitimize the project, Serena had been structuring the deal so that her equity stake was backed by public interest clauses. If they tried to sideline her, they wouldn't just be cutting out an investor, they'd be dismantling a project already tied to federal sustainability grants and local economic revitalization programs. In other words, she had made herself the keystone. Remove her, and the arch would collapse. But Serena didn't broadcast this. She didn't threaten. She didn't even flinch in the next few meetings when they subtly pressured her to reconsider ownership. Instead, she listened. She took notes, and every time they underestimated her, she smiled, because she knew the most dangerous kind of intelligence is the kind no one knows you have. What she was doing was pure behavioral strategy. Information asymmetry. She had more critical knowledge than they realized. Delayed revelation, holding back her leverage until the moment of maximum impact. Psychological misdirection, letting them think she was operating from a place of dependency, rather than quiet control. She didn't know it yet, but the first test of this hidden power was coming sooner than she planned, and it would arrive not in a negotiation but in a very public humiliation. The invitation came with gold-embossed lettering, the Global Energy Leaders Summit. It was the kind of event where major deals are whispered over champagne, and policies are shaped in backroom lounges. Serena had been slated to speak on the main stage alongside the Lawsons, unveiling their historic clean energy initiative. It should have been a victory lap. The conference ballroom was packed, reporters, investors, government officials, cameras streaming live to an audience of thousands. Serena waited backstage, her notes ready, her mind steady. She had rehearsed this speech for weeks, careful to weave in both the economic and humanitarian dimensions of the project. Then, 10 minutes before she was due to go on, one of the Lawson aides walked in with a neutral smile. "Change of plans," he said. "Mr. Lawson will be presenting the full initiative. We SEP allocated you a brief acknowledgement in his remarks." Just like that, erased. When Serena stepped out onto the stage, it wasn't as a co-architect of a billion-dollar project, it was as a footnote in someone else's narrative. William Lawson III spoke first, painting the project as a visionary leap forward. His leap forward, Serena's name appeared on one slide. One. And then came the final twist of the knife. He introduced her as a valuable consultant, who's been helping our team bring this to life. Consultant. Not partner. Not co-founder. Consultant. The room applauded politely. Cameras flashed. Somewhere in the front row, a journalist who had been following Serena's work lowered her pen, her expression shifting from admiration to confusion. In that moment, the humiliation wasn't just personal, it was strategic. By reframing her publicly as a secondary player, the Lawsons were preemptively weakening her bargaining position. If they could make the world believe she was just a consultant, then removing her from the deal entirely would look like a routine business decision, not a betrayal. Here's what made it worse. Serena had no immediate way to correct the record without appearing defensive or bitter, a trap countless underestimated leaders have fallen into. When she stepped off the stage, she didn't go to the networking lounge, she didn't smile for photos, she found an empty corner of the conference center, sat down and let the silence sink in. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Doubt. Had she misjudged her leverage? Was she already too deep in their system to fight back? The truth is, in every transformational story, there's a point where the protagonist looks into the abyss and wonders if they've already lost. That's not weakness. That's the moment that forces clarity. Serena didn't know it yet, but this was her breaking point, and breaking points are dangerous. You either shatter completely or you forge something unbreakable. The night after the conference, Serena returned to her hotel room, dropped her leather portfolio on the desk, and sat in the dark. The city lights beyond the window blinked like indifferent eyes. The humiliation was still fresh, replaying in her mind. William Lawson's smooth voice, the polite applause, the cameras capturing her as nothing more than a consultant. She could walk away now, she thought, let them have their deal, collect whatever advisory fee they offered, and disappear into the next project. It would be easier, cleaner. But then her phone buzzed. It was a message from Mariah Ellis, a journalist Serena had known for years. "Saw the panel today. They cut you out of your own work. I know there sits a bigger story here. If you ever want it told, I am listening." Serena stared at the message. Mariah wasn't just any journalist. She had a reputation for methodical, fact-based exposés that toppled more than one corporate giant. But going public now would be a nuclear option, one that could make her look vindictive if she didn't have an airtight case. She set the phone down, and then something shifted. Her father Sep's words came back to her. "They Sept are betting you, so take what you Sept are given, because it's Sep's easier than fighting." Serena realized she had been thinking too small. She had been fighting for her piece of the deal, when the real power lay in deciding whether the deal could exist at all. She pulled out her laptop and opened a file she had been quietly building for months, a living document that tracked every community partnership, regulatory filing, environmental assessment, and municipal agreement tied to the project. And then she opened a second file, the one with the Lawsons' vulnerabilities. Delayed compliance filings. Questionable subcontractor histories. A pending lawsuit in another state involving environmental violations. Individually these were small cracks. Together they were fault lines. Here sits the insight that flipped the entire outcome. The Lawsons had the money, but Serena had the architecture of the deal. She knew exactly where to press so that if she withdrew her participation, the entire structure would become unstable, politically, financially, and reputationally. She didn't need to fight them in the open. She could make it so that their billion-dollar project couldn't survive without her, and then decide if they were worthy of keeping her. Over the next week she began mapping a silent counteroffensive, strengthening her alliances with local governments and nonprofits, quietly securing alternative funding sources that bypassed the Lawsons entirely, letting select people in her network know that she was exploring other partners, just enough to make its way back to the family. This wasn't such revenge, this was leverage. She didn't know it yet, but her decision to fight from the shadows would set the stage for a public reversal so complete that even the Lawsons would have to applaud. In war, the loudest moves are often the least effective. Serena knew this, that's why she didn't storm into the Lawsons' offices or fire off indignant emails. Instead, she began what she called the silent climb, the slow, deliberate process of reclaiming control, without announcing her intentions. The first move was deceptively simple. She scheduled a community engagement tour. Officially, it was to reinforce the project's commitment to underserved neighborhoods. Unofficially, it was to deepen her direct relationships with the very municipalities whose approvals the Lawsons needed to proceed. In city after city, Serena met with mayors, council members, and local economic boards, not in conference rooms, but in their communities. She toured solar installation sites, walked through neighborhoods where clean power would lower energy bills, and took photos with residents whose faces told a story no press release could match. These weren't just photo ops. Each handshake, each conversation was a strand in the web she was weaving, a web that made her indispensable. The second move was more technical. Serena began revising certain project proposals, to include language that tied grant funding and tax incentives directly to her oversight role. These revisions were small, buried in the legal phrasing, but they meant that if she exited the project, millions in funding would vanish with her. Meanwhile, whispers began circulating in the industry. Investors who once saw the Lawson partnership as a sure thing started hearing about Serena's independent opportunities. A few even approached her privately, offering to back a solo version of the project. Here sits the psychology behind it. People don't chase stability, they chase momentum. By making it look like she was already moving upward without the Lawsons, Serena created a gravitational pull. Suddenly the billion-dollar family didn't look like the inevitable winners. They looked like they were trying to keep up. And still, Serena said nothing to the Lawsons directly. No threats, no ultimatums. She let the unease grow on its own. But the real test came when William Lawson requested a private dinner to discuss the future of the partnership. The invitation was cordial, but the subtext was clear. They'd begun to feel the shift. As Serena dressed for the meeting, she wasn't thinking about how to win their approval. She was thinking about how to make them realize they no longer held the only keys to the castle. What she didn't know was that this dinner wouldn't just be a conversation, it would be the moment when the entire balance of power flipped, in front of witnesses. The restaurant was one of those private, members-only clubs where the walls seemed to absorb secrets. Candlelight flickered off polished silverware, the kind of place where deals worth hundreds of millions were made with nothing more than a handshake. Serena arrived precisely on time. William Lawson III was already seated, a glass of Bordeaux in hand. Across from him sat his eldest son Matthew, and the family's chief legal counsel. Serena, William said smoothly, "We appreciate you coming. We stits like to get this project back on track before the market starts asking questions." He didn't mention that those questions had already started. Investors were jittery. Journalists were sniffing around. Serena smiled politely. "Of course, I am always happy to discuss the future of the project." The waiter poured wine, small talk was exchanged, and then William leaned forward, voice low but firm. "Let's be frank. We want you fully on board, but in an advisory role. We're prepared to increase your compensation significantly." It was the same offer as before, just with a bigger check attached. They still wanted her out of ownership. Serena placed her napkin gently on the table. "I appreciate the offer, but I've made some commitments to communities, to funders, that require me to remain an equity partner. Those commitments are legally binding." Matthew frowned. "Legally binding? We control the corporate entity, Serena." Serena met his gaze, unflinching. "Not the municipal agreements, not the federal grants, and not the state-level environmental permits, all of which name me, personally, as a co-signatory. Remove me, and those agreements dissolve, which means your tax incentives disappear, your land use approvals are revoked, and your financing evaporates." The lawyer set's fork froze mid-air. She continued, calm and steady. "I've also been approached by 3 separate investment groups, ready to back the project independently. They've requested my decision within the month. I haven't responded yet, out of respect for this partnership." The silence was heavy. Here's the thing about a public reversal. It doesn't always happen in front of cameras. Sometimes it happens in a room so small you can hear someone's pulse quicken, but the shift is undeniable. Everyone in that moment knows who holds the power now. William sat back slowly, the smooth confidence in his eyes dimming just enough for Serena to notice. He understood, the game had turned. Then the unexpected happened. A group from a neighboring table, city officials from a key project location, stopped by to greet Serena warmly, thanking her for her direct involvement in bringing jobs and clean energy to their district. They didn't even acknowledge the Lawsons. Witnesses. By the time the dinner ended, the Lawsons weren't negotiating from a place of control. They were negotiating from a place of need. Serena didn't set gloat, she didn't raise her voice. She simply stood, thanked them for their time and said, "I will review the terms when they reflect my role accurately, otherwise I have other avenues." And with that, she left them sitting in the soft glow of the candlelight, billionaires, suddenly aware they might be on the losing side. 3 weeks later, the headlines told the story, though not the one the Lawsons had planned. Historic clean energy deal, restructured amid leadership shift. Daniel secures majority stake in billion-dollar initiative. Lawsons step back from project following community pressure. It was a masterclass in narrative control. Serena hadn't leaked a single damning detail. She hadn't called a press conference. Instead, she let the story emerge organically through the voices of community leaders, municipal officials, and advocacy groups who publicly credited her with championing the project's mission. Behind the scenes, the Lawsons had little choice. Pulling out entirely would have meant losing every major approval and grant. Staying in under the old terms was impossible. So they negotiated a quiet compromise. Serena would retain her full equity stake, gain operational authority, and they would maintain a reduced financial role, without public acknowledgement of the internal power struggle. The business press called it a strategic realignment. Insiders knew better. For Serena, victory didn't mean destroying the Lawsons, it meant neutralizing their control. The project would still move forward, but under governance that protected its original mission. Renewable energy infrastructure would still be built, jobs would still be created, and the neighborhoods that were usually last in line for investment would be first. Here's what it cost her: months of quiet strain, relationships in the industry that cooled under the pressure, and a few investors who decided she was too independent for their taste. But those who remained, loyal, committed, ready to back her future ventures without hesitation. The redemption was subtle but powerful. At the project's groundbreaking ceremony, Serena stood on stage flanked not by billionaires, but by local leaders and residents. The applause was loud, but it was the kind of applause that comes from genuine belief, not social obligation. In her speech, she didn't mention the Lawsons once. Instead, she spoke of resilience, collaboration, and the responsibility of leadership to those who can't buy a seat at the table. And yet the people who knew the full story understood. This wasn't just a groundbreaking, this was the quiet end of a dynasty's unchecked influence over a sector they thought they controlled. The Lawsons left the event early. No cameras followed them out. When the dust finally settled, Serena didn't frame what happened as a victory over the Lawsons. That was never the point. What she had done was something far more enduring. She had proved that control is not a gift to be granted, it is a position to be earned, protected, and when necessary, taken back with precision. Months after the groundbreaking, she was invited to speak at a leadership forum for young entrepreneurs. Standing in front of a room filled with dreamers, builders, and future changemakers, she told the story, not of the insults or the deal itself, but of the moments. "The world will hand you a role," she said, her voice steady. "Sometimes that role will be generous. More often it will be small, designed to make you grateful for the crumbs, while someone else feasts. You have to decide, in the quiet of your own mind, whether you're going to play the role they've assigned, or write your own." She paused, letting the silence stretch. Here's what that moment in the ballroom taught me. You don't have to react to every insult. Sometimes the smartest response is no response at all, at least, not until you've built the leverage to change the game entirely. Power is patience, and patience is preparation. The room was silent, every ear tuned to her words. And remember this, a single action can flip the entire outcome. But that action works only if you laid the groundwork long before the moment arrives. Don't prepare to win the battle you see. Prepare to win the one they don't fighting. She closed by challenging them, not with hype, but with invitation. If this story resonates with your values, share it, discuss it, use it to remind yourself and others that dignity and strategy are not opposites, they are allies. And when you combine them, there sits no dynasty, no system, no table you can stand at as an equal. The applause was warm and sustained, not explosive, not theatrical, just deeply real. And as she left the stage, she knew this wasn't just about a billion-dollar deal, this was about the blueprint, a way of moving through the world that others could adapt, not just to survive injustice, but to dismantle it without losing themselves in the process.